Dear students, today we are going to study about the peasant movements in the post-colonial India. Welcome learners. India has a long history of peasant movement dating back to the colonial period when the farmer in different parts of India revolted against zamindars, landlords and British colonial masters. These movements were the results of severe exploitation, oppression, loss of rights over land, the imposition of new taxes and new agrarian relations of the peasant with the colonial state or the feudal lords. This was studied in detail in the previous module. It was obvious that with the termination of the colonial rule, the character and the nature of the peasant movement underwent a sea change. The post-independent India saw different peasant struggle in the recent past. Peasant movements led by Marxist and socialists such as Telangana movement, Tibaga movement, Kagoda movement and Lalgar movement. Now, in this session, we shall study in detail about the agrarian conflict in the post-independent India. The objective of this session is to study about the peasant movement in the post-colonial period. The objective is further discussed under the themes as post-independence agrarian movement, under which we will study about agrarian contradictions, form of protest, farmers' organization and movements, and then the three-stage theory of peasant movements. Post-independence agrarian movements. In the post-independence period, some of the issues and problems of the peasants continued to be raised in the peasant movements. Through the nature of these movements underwent a change. The nature of the peasant questions in the post-independent phase was characterized by a dramatic shift. Studies of the peasant movements generally points towards the existence of the structural contradiction in the system of land relations and movements as the creation of those contradictions. Agrarian contradictions. The peasant struggles were earlier directed towards the zamindars and jagirdars at a micro level and towards colonialism at a macro level. Rajendran Singh mentions that the agrarian contradictions now begin to be located mostly around the civil society versus the state and the emergent aggressive middle peasantry versus the rural poor and landless. The swollen middle class peasantry constitutes the rising new kulaks of the rural India at present. It is they who confront the state for achieving more gains, as is evident in the farmers' movement. One of the most enduring impact of the Green Revolution has been the emergence of the class of middle peasant who now confront the state above them and the landless and the rural poor located at the lowest level of the socio-economic hierarchy. The landless rural poor in turn are also defiant rather than passive in this fight which involves them, the state and the middle peasants. The post-independent period saw a change in the nature of agrarian classes and interest resulting from the state policies. Accordingly, two categories of rural struggles could be identified by A.R. Desai. The movement launched by newly emergent proprietor class comprising of rich farmers and middle peasant proprietors, and the movement launched by various sections of agrarian proletariats. The rural poor consisting of the poor peasants, women are rapidly rising agrarian proletariat belonging to the lower caste and from a varied ethnic, linguistic and qualitatively new type of society where a decent, dignified existence could be ensured. These contradictions are said to be a consequence of the sweeping developmental policies of the state, democratic participation of the people in the sharing and shaping of the power in the making of the state, the new production technology, the heightened sense of rural-urban exchange, the rise of the dominant class of the rich peasants, the relatively unchanged conditions of the rural poor and the lower caste accelerated the process of social mobility, that is the migration and communication, etc. Forms of protest. Anand Chakravarti makes an in-depth struggle the Santhal Bataiders, that is the sharecroppers of Purnia district, which took place in the 1970s. He highlights the nature of the failure of the land reform policies, the persistence of the landlords and maliks of the oppressed sections, and the struggle and the uprising, the oppressed against the oppressing section of the maliks owners, the listed scope, the success of the struggles of the oppressed and the nature of the persistence of the conflict core in the countryside, keeping alive the agrarian conditions for the peasant revolt. Thus, peasant mobilization have been regarded as an unfinished struggle. They emerged due to the failure of the land reform policies in India. Change in the mode of production in agriculture did not disturb the traditional relationship in any significant manner, in that the exploitative, feudal, hierarchical relations continued. Further, commercialization of the agriculture was not accompanied by modernization of agriculture. One of the most significant rebellions which took place during the decade of the 60s, whose implications were far reaching, was the Naxalbari movement of 1967 and 68. The movement demanded the abolition of the zamindari system and the land to be restored to the tiller, protesting against tenant eviction, land alienation, cultivators' rights to go on cultivating without surrendering, and so on. It enjoyed the support of the rich peasants who had undergone a downward mobility due to the loss of the land over the years, as well as the sharecroppers and poor landless agricultural labourers, but it was fragmented. It was found that as a section of the peasantry succeeded in meeting its own demands, it withdrew from the struggle. Though there was a worker peasant alliance in the earlier part of the struggles. Later on, the movement was overtaken by the urban youth and it gradually lost its goal of the peasant upliftment and lapsed into acts of violence. The peasant movements in the independent India have become more internally differentiated. The class interests of the rich peasant and landowners have diverged from those of the small cultivators, sharecroppers and landless labourers. Since the Green Revolution, which was accompanied by the capitalist agriculture, a deeper penetration of the market economy and globalization, peasant struggles have undergone a change. Farmers' organizations and movements. Subsequently, in this period, farmers have been demanding remunerative prices of their produce, concessions and subsidies in the prices of the agricultural inputs, lowering of the water, fertilizer, electricity and irrigation charges and betterment levies, easier terms for the agricultural loan, etc. Farmers' organizations like the Shetkari Sangatana in Maharashtra and Bharatiya Kisan Union, that is BKU in Uttar Pradesh, and Kedut Samaj in Gujarat, Tamil Nadu and Punjab have come to wield a lot of political importance and clout. Farmers' movements have been quite content staying outside the national parties and have found that they were most effective when they work as a pressure group outside established structures. Although some farmers' movement like Shetkari Sangatana have given rise to the dichotomy between the Bharat versus India, in a study the Bankar Gupta has shown how the Bharatiya Kisan Union has tried to win over the urban areas by the call of Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. These movements primarily see themselves as concerned with economic issues, and its enemy is the state, not the local overlord or exploiters. In the other words, they do not absolve the government of its alleged apathy towards the rural issues. Posts in 1970s also show and saw a change in the nature of the peasant struggles, which led to the forging of peasant workers alliance initially during the Naxalbari movement and later on in political groups like Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangatana, which calls itself a non-party people's movement of the landless and rural poor, striving for issues like the redistribution of land and minimum wages. Having found a niche in Rajasthan, the MKSS went beyond the issues of the peasant cultivators and raised the concern about certain basic rights like the workers' rights to work and receive minimum wages under the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and program, which they were denied in the absence of the records. Next, we shall study about the three-stage theory of the peasant movements. The farmers' movements form part of the wide variety of the social movements witnessed in post-independence India. Based on the criteria like patterns of the land ownership, states development prioritizes technologies, the class structure of the peasant movement and leadership, Sudha Pai provided a three-stage theory of peasant movements. Agrarian movements in the post-independence India fall into three categories. The one, anti-feudal movements against exploitation by landlords or against the state demanding redistribution of land, higher wages for labor, lower rents to small peasants and an end to other exploitative practices. In the immediate post-independence period, discontent arising out of the failure of the state to fulfill its promise of the land reform resulted in several land grab movements led by the peasant leaders, who in many cases belonged to the socialist and communist parties or organizations. While agitations against the landlords continue in the form of Naxalite movements, the issue of land redistribution lost importance with the shift from an institutional to a technological agrarian policy in the mid-1960s. Number 2. Movements by rich peasants or capitalist farmers following the Green Revolution in the 1960s and the resulting commercialization of agriculture and class differentiation. Led by rich farmer organizations, these movements acted as a pressure group upon the state and demanded policies beneficial to them. A section of the bigger farmers who benefited from the Green Revolution became the new power holders in the countryside. The state and not the landlord was viewed as the enemy, and the larger issues such as urban versus the rural interest and the terms of trade with the industry have been central to these movements. Employing strategies different from the first category, they have in some cases mobilized the small peasantry but have little to offer to small tenants and landless laborer. Based on the economic interest, some employed a caste class strategy reflecting the specificities of the Indian context. Number 3. Since the early 1990s, due to the general crisis in Indian agriculture that resulted in a slowdown in the rate of agricultural growth and the structural adjustment program, that is the SAP, leading to the globalization of the Indian economy and resultant changes in the policy regime, farmers' movements have entered a new phase. There have been few large organized rich farmer movements as in the 1980s. Rather, movements are smaller, largely against the state governments that have introduced market oriented policies and no longer attract the small or marginal farmer, as the issues have undergone considerable change. However, in the recent months, with the deepening of economic reforms, movements attracting small farmers have emerged against the acquisition of the agricultural land by state government for the industrial or mining projects of the private, national and international companies. The first phase. In the first phase of the peasant movements, broadly from 1947 to 1970s, the anti-feudal movements were directed against the feudal distribution of land ownership. Thus, land reforms were demanded by peasants. The developmental state was entrusted with the duty to ensure productive ownership of land resource by abolishing intermediaries and oppressive tenancy practices. Thus, the government came with the institutional means to reform land distribution. However, state policies in this phase were quite desperate, as the land was the subject of the state list. Various states implemented land reforms laws in their ways, often leading to the breakdown of the client-master relationship between the tenant and the landowners. The state left enough legal means so that dominant interest would not sacrifice their land. The inefficient land reform laws included tenancy reforms laws and the sealing acts. However, the state was quite successful in abolishing the zamindari, as it was a remnant of the colonialism and the zamindari class was regarded as oppressor by the agrarian struggles. The peasant struggles took the radical turn in the post 1960s, such as the Naxalbari movement, mainly due to the apathy of the state, which was misappropriated by the Maoists, who prompted violent means of the uprooting the state. Academicians have examined the peasant movements in the first phase through three lenses, which broadly develop into nationalist, Marxist and subaltern approaches of study. The nationalist viewpoint, like in many other countries emerging from the colonialism, focused on the issue of the land reform. The revival of the theoretical interest in the institutional question was proposed by the scholars like Gunnar Myrdal. On the other hand, the Marxist theorists like A.R. Desai and D.N. Dhanagir gave a highlighted the development of agrarian proletariat due to the failure of the land reforms. Influenced by the historiographic from the below, subaltern theorists like Partha Chatterjee negated the class-based analysis and exploited the peasant struggles in terms of development of the class consciousness rooted in the idea of the community. These anti-feudal movements were described as providing a model of agrarian transformation for India that relied on not on a single revolutionary leap, but the dynamic interdependence of parliamentary and extra-parliamentary action following each other in quick succession. The latter created possibilities for further legislative action, and the limitations of the farmer could release forces for further extra parliamentary action. However, by the late 1970s, the issue of the land distribution and the equity were overshadowed by capitalist developments in the agricultural sector. The second phase, the Green Revolution, precipitated the development of the rich capitalist farmer movement. The focus of the developmental state shifted from the equity to the productivity guided by the technological means. The selective approach in implementing intensive agricultural development program marked the rise of class differentiation among the Indian farmers. Based on analysis of the farmers who were the owner of the surplus production, Sudha Pai classified the farmers into 4 major classes with regional variations by the end of the 1960s. The capitalist farmers owning more than 10 acres who used hired labor often rented out the land and extracted the surplus in the form of rent. Rich farmers owning roughly 4 to 10 acres self-cultivating and often leasing in the land to increase their holdings. And middle farmers owning between 2 and 4 acres who are the part of the owners and part tenants and depend on the family labor. The small and the marginal farmers who operate 1 to 2 acres, most of whom are tenants and supplement their income with agricultural and landless labor. Politically, the Green Revolution leads to the rise of dominant caste and bullock capitalist. Gail Omwet highlighted the caste factor in the ownership of the land, which made the Green Revolution a resultant factor for class fragmentation intersection with caste. The increasing class differentiation made bigger landowners conscious of their interest, leading to the rich farmers movements in the 1970s. Some scholars described them as new farmers movement as the part of the new social movements of the 1980s as they had distinct characteristics. The peasantry was no longer characterized by pre-political backwardness or social insularity, nor was it simple and passive. It stressed the primacy of the remunerative prices and was non-political, and the class antagonism was replaced by the class collaboration. Along with the spread of the Green Revolution, a specific caste class combination and clan based leadership also contributed to the successful mobilization of the small and medium peasantry in parts of North India. Charan Singh mobilized a substantial section of the cultivating middle backward caste Jats and Gujars both as Kisans and backward caste. However, the dominance of the peasant communities politically was soon undermined by the neoliberal turn of the state. Moreover, the Green Revolution followed by the structural adjustment programs led to the development of the peasant farmers, and the binary of the peasants and the farmer remains no longer valid. The third phase, the state's inability to prioritize agricultural development, is regarded as a primary factor for growing agrarian crisis in the post 1991 India by scholars like Utsa Patnaik and P. Sainath. During the 1990s, many significant developments in the Indian economy have impacted the agricultural sector, and the farmers' movement have changed. The adoption of SAP in 1991 leading to the globalization of the economy has resulted in majority of policy shifts with serious implications for agriculture, that is freeing of controls, removal of subsidies and price support, and a move towards dependence on the market forces and the opening of the economy leading to the freer import or export of agricultural commodities. P. Sainath has even regarded the state as the primary culprit for the rising farmers' suicide due to the state ignorant attitude towards the state of a small and marginal farmers facing the burden of fragilities of the monsoon, market and other externalities. The risk involved in agricultural activity is not cushioned by any other source of income. Thus, the promotion of animal husbandry and horticulture has taken a central stage in the government plans to double the agricultural income in the coming years. Till now, it seems to be a distant dream. there have been few large-scale organized rich farmers movements during the 1990s as in the 1980s. With the changing economic environment, farmers movement display different features. An important reason is the increasing class fragmentation within the farming community. Big farmers movement have become a smaller and mainly in the states region where capitalist agriculture has spread. This is because agriculture is a state subject, and with the end of the centralized planning, many state governments have been active in adopting new market oriented policies. However, in the recent years, we have seen the rise of the farmers movement as seen through the peasant marches to the Delhi. The realization of peasant dreams still seems distant due to the complex mesh of interest groups that has to fight against and the increasing withdrawal of the state from its welfarist role in the market economic system. Conclusion. To conclude, in this session, we have studied about the peasant movement in the post-independent India. The agrarian contradictions are discussed and the farmers' organization formed due to the protest done by the peasants are also explained in detail. Broadly, we can conclude that peasant movement in the first phase were mainly directed against the apathy of the state in implementing the land reforms and the state inability to focus on agricultural development since the second 5-year plan. In the second phase, the peasant movements were more issue based and not ideological. However, they had the objectives of better procurement prices and improved agrarian investment. In the third phase, the peasant movement has grown increasingly fragmented and weakened. Thus, agrarian mobilization has been shaped by two developments in the post-independence India: the centrality of the state in the directing agrarian policies and a capitalist tendencies in the agriculture. With this, we can move to the next session, which is about the peasant movement in contemporary India, the emerging forms of domination and resistance. Thank you.